Good evening. It's good to be with you all this evening. It's always an encouragement to be with everyone here. I want to thank the elders for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I'm thankful and I'm challenged because this will be the first time I've full-length sermon. Lee did such a great job this morning, and I would say I'm sorry that Steve isn't here, but I think I can do just as good a job as Steve, and maybe even better. In fact, I may even be the best speaker that's ever stood on this stage. And I want to talk tonight about pride. Obviously, I'm joking. But that is exactly what pride does to us. It gives us this inflated view of ourselves, so much so that we can't even see we're doing it. In woodworking or in construction, if something is proud, it is sticking up above everything else that's around it. As you can see in this picture, there's a dowel that's yet to be chiseled flat, and it's proud. And that's kind of like the attitude. We elevate ourselves above everything else that's around us, but it's not as our Creator intended. We get this attitude of pride, and we get a little too big for our britches, and we think we know what we're talking about all the time, or we think we deserve something. We deserve more than we actually do. And the product of that, one of those products, is that pride leads us to overstep our boundaries. We want to do something that maybe we don't really deserve to do, or it isn't our place to do. I want to talk about several examples from the Bible and different products of pride tonight. And the first of which being Uzziah, King Uzziah of Judah. He was a very powerful king. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 talks about Uzziah. The first part of the chapter goes over his great deeds, the things that he did, just describing the power that he had. He sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding of the visions of God, says verse 5. It goes on to talk about, all the great men who he had fighting with him, the great battles that he did. He built cities, set up defenses, but he didn't know his place. Verse 16 says, when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. So Azariah, the priest, went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, it is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. You shall have no honor from the Lord God. Then Uzziah became furious, and he had the censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priest, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord. It goes on to talk about how he spent the rest of his days riddled with leprosy, outside in isolation because of his pride. Of course, we know of the example of Saul. Saul did many things that were prideful, but a couple of these examples I want to start with in 1 Samuel 13. 1 Samuel 13 and verse 7. Some of the Hebrews had crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. And he waited 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me and that you did not come within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore, I felt compelled to offer a burnt offering. His fear and pride led him to overstep his boundaries. Fear and pride can go together often. It's not very much longer in the text we read about another instance that Saul shows his pride. Chapter 15, verse 3 says, "Now go," this is a message from God through Samuel to Saul, "now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Pretty clear instructions. Kill everything. Don't leave anything. But in verse 9 it says, "Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and oxen and fatlings and lambs and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed." Saul made this decision based on his own wisdom that they ought to spare these good things. They can't go to waste. He superseded what God told him to do because he thought it was best. He didn't listen to the instruction of the Lord. That's something else pride can do. Pride can deafen our ears, specifically to good counsel. We think we know best when we're prideful. Even if someone has something better to offer or advice of any value, we ignore it because we know best. Rehoboam famously rejected the advice of the elders. 1 Kings 12, verse 7 and 8. They spoke to him saying, if you will, verse 6, the king Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he was still lived and said, "How do you advise me to answer these people?" And they spoke to him saying, "If you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever." But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. How often have we, as young people, when we were young or while we are young, taken the advice of our friends over the advice of people who know better? Admittedly, I did that a lot, and maybe still do from time to time. But it's important for us to recognize that good counsel usually comes from those who have experience and not our peers. Proverbs 11:14 says, "Where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in a multitude of counselors there is safety." So as prideful people, you might not want any advice. You know best. I don't want to hear anything anyone has to say. I know what I'm doing. If you contrast this with somebody like Josiah, 2 Kings 22 verses 1 through 2 says Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. And he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And verse 2 says, "He did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left." As an 8-year-old king who then reigned for 31 years, do you really think it's possible for someone to not turn aside from the right or to the right or to the left without some advice? I really don't think so. I believe he had many good counselors. Ecclesiastes 4:13, the ESV version says this: "It's better to be poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice." There's no point in our lives when we have all the answers. we will always have the ability to take advice and to hear what people have to say, to consider it, whether or not it's worth hearing. It's never going to be something we're going to be living without. Israel, in the book of Jeremiah, explicitly is talked about how they walked in their own ways. Jeremiah 7, verse 23 and 24 says, "This I commanded them, saying, Obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk in the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you. Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but followed the counsels and dictates of their evil hearts, and went backward and not forward." And then in verse 18, it comes out of their own mouths. They say in verse 12, after God has given them the message that they're going to be destroyed unless they turn back, verse 12, they say, "That is hopeless. We will walk according to our own plans, and every one of us will obey the dictates of our evil heart." Sometimes pride doesn't let you hide your sin. Sometimes you know your sin, and you go ahead with it anyway. But the most common type of pride that we suffer from here in the world is the kind that will trick the person who is prideful. Because most of the time, the person who has pride is the last person who will realize they have an issue with it. Pride blinds us to our own sin. Of course we're not sinning. Of course we can't do wrong. That's what a prideful heart would tell us. In Matthew, the 23rd chapter, Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees. And over again, he calls them blind. In chapter 23, first couple of verses says this, that the scribes and the Pharisees sit at Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men, that they make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts and the best seats at the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. That sounds a lot like pride to me. They want the best spot. They want to be respected in the streets. They demand it. But they're not willing to do what they've been taught or what they teach themselves. Going through here, we can see how many times he calls them blind. Verse 16, he calls them blind guides. 17, fools and blind. 19, fools and blind. And then verse 26, blind Pharisee. And again, you can almost feel what they would feel like just being called blind over and over again, just being utterly called out. He goes again to talk about the Pharisees in a parable that he tells. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. It's pretty commonly associated with pride. But if we start there in verse 9, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. If you're unable to see your sin, how well do you think you can confess of your sins? Not very well. Proverbs 11 verse 2 says, when pride comes, then comes shame. But with the humble is wisdom. Pride and shame are also two things that go together. If you don't realize your sin, you're not going to confess of it. But maybe you do. Maybe you do know you have sin in your life. But if anyone were ever to find out, I could never let anyone find out. It would ruin me. That's what shame is. Pride and shame working together in that way. If we can break that down and confess of those sins, that's the only way we can be justified. But to boast of the good things that we do, like the Pharisee does in Luke 18, it will not do anything for us. Pride halts our growth. If we can't confess of our sin, we're not going to move forward in our life. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 17, talks about the Laodicean church. They decided that they were good where they were. It says, because you say, I am rich, have become wealthy, I have need of nothing. But you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Don't let pride deceive you. If you think that you're a big shot, that you're something that you're not, you're mistaken. Galatians 6 verse 3, if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. If you think that verse doesn't apply to you because it says when he is nothing, but I am something, I've got news. You're nothing. We're all nothing. That's what humility is. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 2, if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing, yet as he ought to know. You don't want to take advice? You don't want to hear what people have to say? You think you have all the answers? You don't know anything. 1 John 1:8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If you can't see that you have sin, if you're so prideful that you don't think that you have that problem in your life, you're deceiving yourself. And then Romans 12, verse 16, do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. And there's where the answer is. Humility. This is the obvious answer to the solution to pride. Humility is the pride vaccine, and there's no question about whether or not it works. It works. Matthew 18 and verse 4 says, therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You really want to be great? You're not going to be great here. You must humble yourself, and you'll be the greatest in the kingdom. Being humble as a child. That's where true greatness lies, in humility. Philippians 2 verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. That is an extremely difficult passage. Everyone around you is more important than you. Does that describe how you think? Oftentimes, I fail in that particular. Everyone better than myself? Everyone. James chapter 4, if we want to turn there. James chapter 4, verse 6 gives a perfect summation of the solution to pride. 6 through 10. But he gives more grace. Therefore, he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. More than humility. You can be humble once, but you have to keep being humble, and it takes endurance. And a good verse for this is Philippians 3, verse 12. Not that I have already attained or am already perfected, but I press on, that I may lay hold of that which Jesus Christ has laid hold of me. You're not perfect. We haven't attained the promise. Pride will tell us that we have. We're Christians. We're good. We don't need anything else. We must press on. We haven't made it yet. Humility must be lifelong. If you can't do any of these things, God will solve your pride for you. Well, he did it to Nebuchadnezzar. Just like he did it to Uzziah, just like he did it to Saul. He can solve your pride for you. Daniel chapter 5, verses 18 through 21 says, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. God will humble you if you can't humble yourself. Just like the woodworker, God will take his chisel and he'll knock you down to size. He'll knock the pride right out of you. You have to do that before it's too late. Because when God does it, it will be an eternal decision. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Matthew 23, verse 12. If you're here tonight and you have a pride problem, you may not even realize it. Sincerely look into your heart. Do you overstep your boundaries? Are you blind to the things that you're doing? Do you not listen to other people and their good advice? Are you not growing anymore? Maybe you have a pride problem. If there's anything we can do to help you, we'd like for you to come forward, talk to us about it, or talk to someone after. And if you haven't been baptized for the remission of your sins, you need to do so. Come forward now as we stand and sing.